This is محمد حمودة. I will be with you in this course, issues and problems in translation studies. Actually, the outlines of this presentation is, or this introductory chapter is definitions of translation. What do we translate? And finally, methods of translation. Actually, we will highlight two main methods of translation: free translation and word for word translation. In this lecture, we are going to explain or to talk about uh, word for word or literal translation in details, while the second strategy or the second method, the second method, free translation, will be left to the uh, next lecture. To start with definitions of translation, actually, we cannot find a single definition of translation. Various scholars define translation in different ways based on the way they look at. They look at translation in different angles. For example, from a linguistic level, Catford defines translation as a replacement of textual material from one language, which is the source language, into another language, which is the target language. So, Catford, as we notice, that Catford's definition is at the linguistic level only, and it refers to the replacement of vocabulary of the source language vocabulary into the target text, or moving the source text, or replacement of source text vocabulary into the target text by their equivalent terms. For example, if I have a word in Arabic, in English, such as speak, I render it linguistically or at the linguistic level as يتكلم. Actually, this definition is limited only to the linguistic level, and the linguistic level cannot produce or cannot introduce a well comprehended definition of translation in general. So, for example, a lot of issues are related to translation and have a role in translation studies, such as ideology. For example, ideology, if we take ideological issues into consideration, this definition is limited and does not cover the ideological dimension. So we need another development to overcome these back drawbacks of this definition or Catford's definition. Another definition is introduced by Steiner, and he defines translation as the interpretation of verbal signs of one language by means of verbal signs in another. So we have verbal signs, source language verbal signs, and the target language verbal signs. And when we deal with verbal signs, that means he looks at translation from a semiotic point of view. So Catford looks at translation the at the linguistic level. Now Steiner looks at translation as from a semiotic level or semiotic angle. So as we see, different definitions are because scholars look at the translation studies from different angles and from different sciences such as linguistics or semiotics. Now, at the same time, semiotic level does not cover all aspects of translation. So, another scholar, who is Vermeer, looks at translation from another angle, which is different from Catford and Steiner, and introduces another definition of translation as to produce a text in the target setting for a target purpose and a target addressee in a target circumstances. Look at the target purpose, and this issue is vital in his definition or in Vermeer definition. Actually, Vermeer talks about Scopus theory, and Scopus theory in translation focuses on the purpose of the translation, and the purpose, and it stems from the fact that the purpose of the translation is the compass that directs the translator to in his rendition and in his translation. So, suppose that we have animal form, for example, based on the Scopus theory. Now we look to animal form is a novel in English. Suppose that we are going to translate it into Arabic. According to the Scopus theory, we should look at the purpose of this translation. Now, if the addressee of this translation is children, addressees are children. Now, in our translation, we should highlight funny scenes. هنركز على الfunny scenes. But the same novel, if we want to translate it for example political science students لطلاب علوم سياسية, we should highlight the comic scenes and and reflect the hierarchical structure of the society and the dominance and the oppression of the governed of the governors and so on. So the purpose of translation determines the process of translation. Now Vermeer introduces the translation according to the Scopus, introduces a definition of translation according to the Scopus theory, and he looks at the purpose or the target purpose as the main component and the main rule of translation. Now, another definition is introduced by Venotti, a process and who translates or who defines translation as a process by which a chain of signifiers that constitute the source language text is replaced by a chain of signifiers in the target language which the translator provides on the strength of an interpretation. Now, Venotti actually looks at the translation from ideological and political aspect as a rewriting process. Translation is not only rendering from vocabulary from one language into another, but it is the process of rewriting a text and produces a text in another language, but it is a rewriting process. So the translator may be influenced by the ideological aspects or ideological beliefs. For example, Israeli Defense Forces, قوات الدفاع الإسرائيلي. The translator may render it or may render this term as قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي because ideology plays a role in the translation process. So Venotti looks at translation from political and ideological angle, while Vermeer looks at translation from Scopus theory from the point of view of the Scopus theory. Steiner looks at translation from semiotic aspect, and finally Catford looks at translation from linguistic aspect. Now look at Ghazali 2007 defines translation as the process of transferring the meaning from the source language into the target language as closely, completely, and accurately as possible. Now, if you look to the definition of Ghazala, what is the meaning of what he means by what does he mean by the meaning? the meaning, transferring the meaning. So we may ask ourselves that what is he meant by the meaning? What is meant by the meaning? So now actually, is it the the syntax? It is is it the grammar? Is it the style? Is it the vocabulary only? Or so now look at what does look actually Ghazala states that the meaning comprises four components or the four components of language as we are going to see in next slides. Now what do we translate? According to Ghazala, we usually translate the meaning. But what is meant by the meaning? Look, the meaning, he defines the meaning as a complicated network of language components, syntax, vocabulary, style, and phonology. So he means he means by meaning, he refers to meaning as the four component of language, something which includes the four components of language, the syntax, which is the grammatical level, vocabulary, which is the semantic level, style, and the phonology, which is the sound level or the sound system of the language. So the meaning comprises all the components of language, thus this what is meant by. So Ghazala's definition is wider and more comprehensible than or compared with the previous definitions of Stinner's, Veneer, or Catford, and so on. Look at this picture. Language components. The first one in grammar level, on grammatical level, or in the syntactic level, we can look at sentences, clauses, word order, tenses, models, questions, negations, and so on. In the vocabulary level or at the semantic level, we are going to talk about, we can look at synonymy, polysemy, antonymy, and collocations, idioms, proverbs, and so on. At the style level, we can look at formality and informality, parallelism, ambiguity, repetition, redundancy, and so on. And finally, at the phonological level, we can look at rhyme, rhythm, alliteration, assonance, meter, foot, and so on. Now, if you look at, or if general in translation, we focus on the meaning and we focus on the grammatical vocabulary and style first of all. But in poetry, for example, sometimes the features, the prosodic features like rhyme or rhythm, alliteration are more important than the meaning or than the content itself. Thus, in this situation, we will highlight the phonological aspect. So, the text type is very important and it plays an important role in translation. If it is a prose, if it is a prose, we will highlight, for example, the content or the content. If it is if it is poetry, for example, we will highlight the prosodic aspects. I mean the phonological aspects. So we should be we should respect the four components of language, but some aspects will be maybe highlighted than other aspects. Okay, according to the purpose of the translation and the text type. Now, methods of translation. Actually, we talked about two dichotomous strategies from the very beginning of the translation or the history of translation studies. We have two dichotomous strategies: free translation versus literal translation. But these two translation strategies are known or are named in different ways. For example, literal translation versus free translation. Newmark called them semantic translation versus communicative translation. Semantic means literal, while communicative means free translation. Formal equivalence versus dynamic equivalence. NIDA, for example, called free translation and literal translation as formal and dynamic equivalences. Thirdly, non-idiomatic versus idiomatic translation. Newmark calls literal translation as non-idiomatic translation, while free translation as idiomatic translation. But all of them refer to the same dichotomous strategies, which are literal translation versus a free translation. Now, look to start with literal translation. Actually, literal translation comprises or includes three sub-strategies. The first one is word for word literal translation, as from its name, word for word. So, it deals with or it deals at the word level. It looks at the text from the word level. For example, that child is intelligent. In Arabic, that is rendered as ذاك, child is rendered as الطفل, is rendered as يكون, intelligent is rendered as ذكي. ذاك الطفل يكون ذكيا. So, as we see, the number of the words in the source text is 4 words, and in the target text is also 4 words. So, the number of words is kept is the same. The second thing, as you see, verb to be is rendered as yakun, and these two drawbacks of this strategy. Look at Mary wanted to take tea. Mary wanted أرادت to and take تأخذ tea شاي. Mary أرادت أن تأخذ الشاي. Look at this translation is non-idiomatic. In Arabic, we don't use take tea as تأخذ الشاي. We say تشرب الشاي, for example, but not تأخذ الشاي. So at the idiomatic level, we can we this translate or this strategy ignores the idiomaticity of certain expressions. Okay. Third, he is living from hand to mouth. هو يكون عائشا من اليد إلى الفم. هو يكون عائشا من اليد إلى الفم. The same number of words is rendered as يكون. Idiomaticity the idiomaticity is not taken into consideration. It is completely neglected. We cannot use this expression من الفم إلى اليد. This is something unknown in Arabic. It is strange in Arabic. So this strategy is something strange or does not introduce well comprehended translation or well comprehended source target text. I mean, please stay with me on campus. من فضلك ابقى معي على الحرم الجامعي. على الحرم الجامعي. No, we say for example في الحرم الجامعي وليس على الحرم الجامعي. Stop beating about the bush. أوقف الضرب حول الشجرة أو the bush الشجيرة. أوقف الضرب. All these. This man is a big shot. هذا الرجل يكون رمية كبيرة. I know this information. أنا أعرف هذه المعلومة. All of these expressions or all of these target text sentences are something strange in Arabic language. Why? Because idiomaticity is not taken into consideration. The grammatical aspect of English, the English grammar is kept in Arabic translated version, and this is something wrong. So to highlight the to highlight the negative aspects of word for word translation, first of all, it ignores the target text completely. It talks about only the source text, and it moves the grammatical aspects of the source text into the target text as as if they are in the source text without any kind of changes. So grammatical differences between the source text and the target text is completely or are completely neglected. The third, the context is not taken into consideration as من اليد إلى الفم. The context of this is not taken into consideration. It is completely neglected. Thirdly, if suppose we have a word which does not have an equivalent term in the target text, how can we translate it based on word for word literal translation? Impossible. We cannot translate it at all. So the drawbacks of literal or this word for word literal translation are grammatical grammatical differences are neglected. The context also is neglected. The target text or the target language is completely neglected also. The equivalent terms, the lack of equivalences, if we have a term or word which does not have an equivalent term in the second language, we cannot render it at all based on this strategy. Also, this strategy is at the word looks at translation from the word level only. To look how to overcome these strategies, first of all, we can delete verb to be at all. For example, يكون can be is, am, is, are, is not, are not be translated. For example, بدل من ذلك الطفل يكون ذكيا is, no need to render is as يكون. We can say ذاك الطفل ذكي. ماري أرادت أن تأخذ شايا، أن تشرب شايا أو أن تتناول شايا. من اليد إلى الكفاف. The context, if the context is taken into consideration, we can say يعيش على الكفاف. من فضلك امكث أو ابقى معي على الحرم الجامعي. في الحرم الجامعي. أوقف الضرب حول الشجرة. If the context is taken into consideration and the idiomaticity of the English expression is taken into consideration, also we can say كف عن المراوغة and so on. No need to render أنا as a pronoun. أعرف هذه المعلومة or أعرف هذه المعلومات because information in English is uncountable noun. It can be a single information معلومة واحدة, and it can be a collection of information معلومات. So in Arabic it is better to say المعلومات for information. Look, the second sub-strategy of literal translation is one-to-one literal translation strategy. Actually, this strategy means the replacement of each word or phrase in the source text by an identical word or phrase in the target text. Now, what is the difference between this strategy, one-to-one literal translation, and the previous strategy, word-to-word literal translation? Actually, as we said, word-to-word translation looks at the translation from a word level, while one-to-one literal translation looks at the translation from a word level and also at the phrase level. So not only the word level but also the phrase level. Uh, another another difference is that this strategy looks at the collocation and metaphorical aspects of language. So Idiomaticity is taken into consideration in this strategy one-to-one type. We are going to take say, some examples such as my neighbors are good. جيراني يكونون طيبين. سانيو is a well-known trade maker. سانيو تكون علامة تجارية معروفة. Actually, no need to render are in the first sentence or is in the second sentence. We can say جيراني طيبين, producing a nominal sentence which is absent in English. So grammatical differences here also not taken into consideration because uh, the grammar or the source text grammar is kept in the target text. As we look also the same number of words. So look at we have Sanyo is a well-known trade maker. Also, we have the same number of words. Look at I. All that glitters is not gold. ما كل ما يلمع ذهبا. Actually, here the context is taken into consideration, unlike the previous strategy, word for word translation. Uh, the drawbacks of this translation actually it does not or it neglects the grammatical differences between the source language and the target language. For example, English, Arabic. In Arabic, we have nominal sentences which do not include any verb, while in English, nominal sentences are absent. We can, however, in in our translation, following this strategy, or we should render the same structure and the same grammatical aspects found in the source text. Okay, the second the second drawback is that يملك, for example, no need to render يملك or يكون, have verb to be or verb to have, no need to render them. The second drawback is that insisting the existence of the same number of words. Actually, as we said, if we have three, if the sentence, the source text, if the source text sentence includes four words, the target text will include the same number of words. So the number of words is returned. The collocations also which have no equivalents, for example shake hands, يصافح بالأيادي. يصافح الأيادي actually in English, we in Arabic we does not say يصافح الأيادي, we do not say يصافح الأيادي. It is enough to say يصافح and that's enough. So some collocations in English have no equivalent collocations or have no equivalent counterparts in Arabic, but this is translation or this strategy looks at or keeps the collocation as it is. If we have a collocation, we should or we must render it as a collocation. But if we do not have a collocation, if the English version has a collocation such as shaking hands, but in Arabic we cannot find a collocation or a counter collocation which is equivalent to the source text collocation. Thus, we have a problem in this following this strategy. Okay. Now, how can we modify this translation? دعنا نتصافح بالأيادي. We can say دعنا نتصافح or لنتصافح and that's enough. هو يكون شابا وهو يكون طيب القلب. Actually, in English, look at the original sentence. He is a young man. He is kind-hearted. Actually, these two simple sentences in English, we can render it as a one sentence in Arabic. But following this strategy, we should render them as two sentences. They are two sentences in English, so in Arabic, we must render them as to sentences, and this is one of the drawbacks of one-to-one literal translation. So to summarize the drawbacks of literal translation, first of all, it keeps the same number of words. Secondly, or second the second drawback is that the collocation or the metaphor should be rendered as a collocation or as a metaphor, neglecting the fact that some collocations do not have counterparts in the other language. Thirdly, the number of sentences also should be rendered as the same number of sentences, while in Arabic we may render two simple sentences in one sentence, and so on. Okay, now look at we are going to talk about the third sub-strategy of literal translation, which is direct translation of meaning. Actually, as we said, the translation here, translating the meaning as closely and accurately as possible, we render the meaning, not the grammatical aspects of the source text. Also, metaphorical and special uses of language are also taken into consideration, and this is one of the advantages of this strategy, the direct translation. The meaning of a word is not fixed, so the word does not have only one meaning, but it may have several meanings based on the context of use. For example, look at the word run. The simple meaning is يجري, but according to this strategy, run may have several meanings based on the context of use. For example, to run in the race يركض في سباق. To run a company يدير شركة. In the long run على المدى البعيد. So run in the three sentences, in every sentence it has different and completely different meaning. So here this strategy looks at two possibilities of meaning. The word may be metaphorically used or may be non-metaphorically used. If, for example, يجري in the first sentence, to run in the race, it is non-metaphorical use. Literal translation, the word run rendered as يركض or يجري, while in the second or in the third, in the rest sentences, it is used where run is used metaphorically. For example, to run a company, it does not mean to يركض يركض شركة أو يجري شركة, but it means يدير شركة. And that's the next lecture we are going to continue and talk about free translation and other translations. That's all for this lecture. Thank you very much. If please, if you have any question, feel free to ask whatever you want. Thank you very much.